2024. This has been a really, really hard year for startup companies. Access to investment has been lower compared to previous years. And companies this year have actually started buckling down to try to preserve their cash flow in anticipation of future dry spells. And this year, if many of you have remembered, it began with massive layoffs. Google laid off Amazon in record numbers, and large tech organizations that have had these layoffs impacted many of the employees and contractors that also lived here in Canada. We have been left with a glut of highly skilled technical workers with little employment opportunities. Welcome to Tech Uncensored. My name is Hessie Jones, and today we're tackling the human side of the startup company, the state of founders and employees in 2024. So I'm going to start with a couple of statistics that summarize the events of this past year. Total headcount across the startup ecosystem has remained flat, with only a few sectors such as energy, medical devices showing any kind of significant employment growth. January 2024 saw significant declines in new hires. This was down 30% from January 2023, and it continued to follow from February through to the summer months, all recording lower hiring numbers compared to previous years. What we also saw was that inflation has been a big factor this year. It's compounded a lot of issues, not only for consumers, but for businesses, because this has created higher business costs, reduced profit margins, and it's been very difficult to even take those higher costs and pass them on to their clients. The EDC actually came out with a report earlier this fall indicating that Canada's unemployment continues to rise because of also a slumping global demand for products and services. Global growth is expected to rise in 2025 by 3%. That's considered fairly low. Canada's anticipated growth is just 1.6%, and this has been constrained with the factor of many of our weakened labor markets. So I'm going to bring Glenn Nishimura to the stage, and he is a startup HR and workplace culture expert and chief people strategist at Nishimura Consulting. And according to Glenn, overhiring is now dead. So he says that first-time or inexperienced founders have had a really difficult time this year navigating and communicating many of these headcount changes to their teams, that there's been discussions about pay freezes, layoffs, what are the impacts on equity. There have been, and what has this done to the cultural shifts? This has all soured many of the experiences of startup employees grappling with the future in the startup economy. So just to give you a little bit of background about Glenn, he works with startups and employees from the brightest startups and scale-ups across Canada, the US, Europe, and Asia. And he counsels founders and he helps them build the right teams, cultivate a resilient and scalable culture, which he coins the startup's immune system. So welcome, Glenn.
Nice to be here, Hessie. Thank you very much for the invitation. Good to be back.
Thank you. I'm glad that you are back. We're going to dive into many of the things that have happened this year for the startup employee and the founder. What's the implications on actually leading a company and the implications on the culture? And then what's next on the horizon for the coming year? So let's get started. I want people to know a little bit more about you. So tell us about your experience, especially your interest in working with many startup organizations.
Sure, happy to. So yeah, I'm an HR guy going back 100 years. And after spending some time in workforce management and banking and tech, about a dozen years ago, I started to mentor young entrepreneurs who were starting their own businesses because I noticed there was a distinct gap and need in the market for people who have an HR background to help these companies to grow. So fast forward a few years, and I now have the pleasure of working with founders from mostly pre-seed, seed, and post-seed startups and scale-ups globally. where I help them to implement smart people practices and solve their people problems. And boy, oh boy, are there ever people problems.
Mhm. Exactly. So, I mean, you heard everything I said in the
Yes.
beginning about how bad this year has been for startup organizations.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this can have a profound impact on culture,
Yes.
especially for some of the early stage startups who are trying to establish what their culture looks like
Yes.
and how they want to actually create an environment that's safe and engaging. So, what have you heard from some of your clients uh, and what they've experienced this year?
Sure. Well, this year, as well as last year, I think have been a real test of just how strong and how resilient and how well ingrained a startup's culture really is. Because it's so easy to say that your culture is working when your MRR is rising steadily, you have dozens of applicants to every job posting, and your employees seem happy. But when the you know what hits the fan, like it has recently, and your business is suffering as a result, ultimately it's going to be your culture that's going to either save you or sink you. So looking back on this year, I would say three main themes have stood out for me. First, I would say that for many first-time and inexperienced founders, they came face to face with what culture really is and what it's not. Not the textbook definition that you read about, but the real life version. Some founders realize that having things like team outings and giving someone their birthday off or gifting everyone free headphones, those were not all that it takes to form a great culture. Now, those are all welcome for sure, but they're superficial. Secondly, I would say that some founders unfortunately suck at delivering bad news. And we've had a lot of that. So whether it's telling the team that you've had yet another down quarter, or you've had to fire a handful of employees, there are a lot of founders that tend to shy away from doing anything that makes them look mean or incompetent or threatens their reputation. And I think ultimately this silence and this inaction can be seen as a lack of courage by your team. And that can have a tremendous detrimental impact on trust and relationships. And lastly, I think some founders realize the hard way that culture forms a core part of your company's reputation. If it's a positive one, people around you are going to be happily and freely recommending their friends and family. But on the flip side, if it's a negative one, word is going to spread like wildfire to stay the hell away from your company.
Mm-hmm.
So we should always remember that an employee who leaves to chase a higher salary may still come back for the culture. But an employee who leaves because of the culture will never return for the salary.
So, what has been your sense from the employee perspective, and have they been experiencing this year as a result of many of these issues?
Yeah, the past couple of years in general have been a real reckoning for many startups, as you know, from pre-seed to Series A and all the way beyond. And I think a lot of the shine that's been associated with working with startups has worn off a little bit. One common theme that emerged from all of the conversations that I've had with laid off employees is they felt disposable. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Many were disillusioned and many resented their leaders and the way that they were treated. And that's not good. They're disillusioned because, the so-called awesome killer culture that they were sold and they were initially attracted to never materialized. And they're resentful because they were oftentimes treated with such disrespect, especially when they were let go. No compassion, no gratitude, no help with finding a new job. They were just kicked to the curb. Some of them deserved severance, but they never got it. Others were promised reference letters. They never received it. And I think this was one driver behind why we saw so many startup employees jump to the corporate sector after being let go. Obviously, it's not as fast paced. It's not as small or as nimble, but it's regular work. It's relatively stable with a steady paycheck. And that's huge these days. One of my neighbors actually down the street, he's a software engineer, and he went to work at one of the big 5 banks after he was laid off. And he was telling me that in hindsight, working for a startup was a huge mistake. and that he discovered that his personality, his working style, and his tolerance for risk were ultimately better suited to the corporate world.
That's actually a little bit sad if you think about it, because I mean, if something like this happens and it sours people's, I guess, perception of what startup is all about,
Yeah.
then we're going to have less entrepreneurship in Canada.
Yes.
We're going
Yes.
to be looking like what's going to happen to the innovation sector. I'm not saying it's going to be like that across the board, but if an early experience like this, especially for a young person that is so enthusiastic
Yes.
about the value of the startup economy,
Yes.
decides that they want to go for something a little bit more
Yes.
stable, what does that do to Canada? Right.
That's write that down. That's probably another Tech Uncensored session.
Yeah, I think so. So
Yeah.
like, so when you talk to founders, what do you say to them about how they communicate this to their employees in a way, and especially because it is a financial impact, but they don't want to necessarily panic their
Right.
staff.
Right.
How do they do that in a way that minimizes the kind of fallout that we've been seeing?
Yeah, that's tricky. First of all, I would say that I hope that startups share company financials with the team on a regular basis in the first place, whether it's part of your State of the Union address with your team or quarterly lunch and learns. It just has to be in there somewhere. If you're in the habit of presenting financials when times are good, don't stop doing them now when times are tough, because that absence is going to speak volumes and it's going to kick the rumor mill into overtime. So if you're doing it, keep doing it. You have to be honest about the situation, but you also have to be prepared to talk about specifics, about how the founding team is going to pull out all of the stops to turn things around. Don't sugarcoat, don't over dramatize, don't omit, don't lie, don't point fingers. Founders have to be the first ones to accept the blame and the last ones to accept the credit. But one thing I will say, though, given my work in the last year particularly, if trust and respect don't already exist between the founders and the team, it's not going to matter what the leaders say to try and quell any anxiety or any panic. The team is simply going to default to, I don't trust these guys. I think the numbers are actually worse than this. These guys never tell the truth. They're hiding something. I heard we're going under soon. If that's the kind of sentiment that people are whispering behind your back, you have deeper problems than your finances.
Yeah.
One engineer I spoke with, and I think I mentioned this to you earlier, she survived, managed to survive a big round of layoffs at her company. So she had a valid question. She asked her co-founders, how is all of this going to impact the cap table, and how's it going to impact my employee stock option plan? They never replied to her. She didn't get a single answer. And that really annoyed her, and it made her very angry. And she lost whatever respect she already had for the co-founders. So that's not good. That's not good at all.
So they're not prepared to deal with this.
Yeah.
And I think from your perspective, and I think maybe this is something that nobody is really prepared to deal with when it actually comes their way. But maybe it's something that they have to figure out, because at some point in time they will have to lay off people.
Yeah.
Right.
It's part of the job, unfortunately.
It's part of the job. So even at the early stages, like how would you counsel a founder in order to properly, as they operationalize a process for how do you lay off? What are the levers that you need to put in place in order to make this work for you and your company, and to also minimize maybe impact to the employees in a way that could be more detrimental?
Yes. I wish there was a playbook that people could just read page by page, right? Say this, don't say this, don't say that. As we touched on it at the beginning here, it's important to keep in mind first that people leaving are a normal part of a startup's journey, especially as your startup grows, right? Layoffs are going to happen as your investors switch their focus from growth to profitability. Layoffs are going to happen as the generalists and the contractors that you hired early on are going to disappear and be replaced with people who are full-time with more depth of expertise. Some of your employees are going to successfully make that transition, and others, unfortunately, won't. But I think it's important for founders to understand that people not staying with you forever is not at all a failure on your part, right? A lot of them do actually internalize that quite a bit. So if you are faced with the task of having to lay off some employees, there are three things I want people to keep in mind. First and foremost, and the most important thing is remind yourself that these are people, and your decision, it's going to have a profound impact on their livelihood and the lives of their families. But if you've exhausted all other avenues, do the layoffs quickly, but do them compassionately. And do it yourself. Because I've seen founders try to pawn off delivering the bad news to other people, myself included, and I always throw it back at them. Others drag it out, which only makes ripping off the proverbial Band-Aid even worse. And I've also seen founders change their minds after an individual cries or gets upset at the news. And I can understand it's hard not to doubt yourself and your decision when you're faced with this, but you have to persevere if it's the right business decision for your company's survival. The second point I want to make is you have to ask yourself, who are the best people that I want next to me when the outlook improves, right? This is the perspective that you should be taking, not, hey, I wonder who earns the most, or who's the last one in, or who do I like the least? You have to look down the road and work backwards. And the data that you get from your financial goals and the strategic objectives based on your OKRs, those will also be instrumental in the thought process of deciding who's ultimately going to stay and who's going to go. You also have to consider both performance and potential. Why potential? Because the people who are performing well right now may not be the people that you need at your side in 12 to 18 months. And the people who are still gaining traction now, maybe they're new employees, may not fully contribute for a few more months. And probably the best and most difficult piece of news that people are going to hear around layoffs is if you're going to cut deep and cut once. Because make no mistake, if even one person in your company is laid off for business or economic reasons, you're signaling to everyone in the entire company that their jobs are now in jeopardy, whether that's true or not. And that fear, that anxiety can have detrimental impacts on them. Harvard Business Review said that performance can drop 20% for those people who are left after layoffs. So really the bottom line here is the fewer times you have to lay people off, even if it's a larger number each time, the better for everyone.
That's great advice. And I think one thing that you had talked about is what are the after effects once everybody has been laid off? What's the impact on those who have been left behind? And there's even going to be a bigger impact on the founders themselves in what they're going through. And this is what I want to talk about next is really how do the founders manage, I guess, their own stress, their own burnout, or when they're going through something like this. What do you say to them?
Well, as people say, you can't take care of others unless you take care of yourself first, right? So one of the key strategies that, and is an easy one to implement, is to just have a strong support system. You don't have to go through this alone. So, oftentimes we're so close and we're so attached to a problem that we fail to see the toll that it's taking on us. And I would rather not see a founder or anyone have to suffer a heart attack before they suddenly realize that they pushed themselves too far. So if you're a solo founder, you should give your life partners or your close friends permission to call out any unusual changes that they see in your behavior. Maybe it's withdrawal that appears unhealthy, physical changes, consuming too much alcohol, bad eating or sleeping habits, changes in temperament, right? All of those signs are red flags, and someone has to call them out because you may not see them yourself. If you have a co-founder or more than one co-founder, I would strongly suggest that you get together and you draft a co-founder social agreement. Now, this isn't a legal document per se or a job description. It's really more of a relationship agreement. So it's basically spells out what everyone is obligated to do when something of consequence happens. Maybe it's interpersonal conflicts, maybe it's big decisions that impact the company. And yeah, when one of the founders is in need of help. Because ultimately, I think how co-founders respect and support each other, especially during really difficult times, is equally as important to the company's success as how each of them function leading their own functional areas. And I think this relationship agreement is a healthy and effective way to ensure that you keep all of the promises that you make to each other.
You know, I've never heard of that before. And I guess it would never occur to me, especially in the experience that I've had working at startups, for something like that to even come about, because you always put on a veil, you put on a face of strength, despite what you're going through, internally. But because you are struggling, it doesn't mean that you should be showing that to the people that you're managing. But you're right. As the co-founder, it's a different story. And I think you have to be there for each other, because if one doesn't know what the other one's going through, not having that foundation of support is not going to help if one is falling through the cracks.
Oftentimes when we're searching for co-founders, that sort of relationship dynamic is often overlooked. I think we talked about this when we did our last Searching for a Technical Co-Founder podcast.
Right.
I think we touched on it a little bit as well. As most people are way too superficial around, well, I'm strong in product, I need somebody strong in tech. Or I'm strong in marketing, I need someone who's strong in product. It has to go much, 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 much deeper than that. And that's why I recommend to some co-founders, you know what, once you're at the latter stages of deciding whether or not you want to bring this person on as a co-founder, you should go out for dinner with your spouses. Right? Just have a casual dinner with the expectation that your spouse or your life partner is going to be, quote unquote, checking this person out to see whether or not they would be a good work wife or work husband or work partner, and see if they will support you in those times, because you may not see it. You may just say, yeah, but we laugh together and this person's strong in tech and, we're going to build some great things together.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the true test of a true partner, and you're right, this is your work husband or work wife, is whether or not you could endure after like a big fight or conflict.
And I'm glad you raised that, because it's one of the things I tell people is, if you've never had a real screaming match with your co-founder, you're not pushing the relationship hard enough. Each of you are holding back in some way. Like they say in racing car, when you're racing cars, like if you haven't hit the wall a few times, you're not going fast enough. So I think if you always get along with your co-founder and you've never had a screaming match, you should have one deliberately and see how both of you come out the other side. If there's resentment and people carry a grudge and whatnot, the relationship's not going to work.
Okay. I want to switch a little bit and talk about compensation, because you had brought up a point about an employee that said, how is this going to affect our share purchase plan or our equity?
Yeah.
When you are a founder and let's say you're early stage and you're hiring people who are already working at rates much below market level, because that's all a startup can afford.
Yeah.
How do you approach some of these compensation packages, especially for those that are losing their jobs? How do you do this fairly? Or is there a way to be fair when the company's running out of money?
Yeah, it's very difficult. So to be clear, we're talking about compensation. And so compensation is the bucket that includes salary, bonuses, options, RSUs, health and dental coverage, all that good stuff. Because a lot of people think salary and comp are synonymous with each other, and they're not. So comp is that bucket of all of that. And it's traditionally been the primary driver in attracting great people, right? We all know that. No surprise there. But it's also no surprise that comp is often a startup's biggest expense. In software companies, it can be 50%. So it's really important to get that balance right. And it's not easy to get that balance right. But it's also important to remember that comp isn't everything. You know, in my industry, we often say that no one is ever happy with their comp, and comp never made anyone happy, because it's true. So here's an example. Let's say that your startup is well-funded, you're cash flow positive, maybe even you're profitable. And let's say you're on the hunt for an AI engineer to join your team, because why not? Everybody's hiring AI people right now, right? The median market salary, the 50th percentile for an AI engineer in Canada right now is about 120K. Let's say that you're offering 130K and a requirement to work in the office 3 days a week. Your competition is offering 118K. Okay, so 12K less than you, but they're offering full remote work. Right? That's often the choice that people are presented with these days. Now, for some people, that 3 day a week in office, maybe not a big deal. But for a lot of people right now, they're placing more and more emphasis on their personal lives, their mental health, and their overall happiness. So going with your competition may earn them 12K less a year pre-tax, but the annual cost savings for transit, fuel for the car, parking, wear and tear on the car and you, lunches, going to Starbucks 8 times a day, being able to walk the dog and do your laundry, all of that is like getting a raise. So the big surprise here is that cash isn't king anymore. It's no longer a level playing field. It's not just about financial factors around who pays top dollar or who covers massage therapy or even who's offering generous equity. It's about intangibles, like a positive reputation as a great place to work, a sense of belonging, feeling trusted and respected. Those are more valuable than money now. So if you can offer those things along with a decent pay package, you're going to be able to punch above your weight and offer something very attractive and compete with startups who have much deeper pockets.
That's good to know. I actually, it never occurred to me, but I remember reading an article about Amazon, and I don't know if you've heard, they're trying to force people back to work.
Yes.
And I think the first time that they had sent out a note to employees, they said, for those people who choose to stay, so first of all, try to come into the office at least 2-3 times a week.
Yeah.
And then what they realized is that people were coming in and they're punching in, but then they would leave. Right? It's a way to show that, yes, I've been there and I stayed for maybe one meeting, but then I leave, which is still detrimental to the employee because all that time that they actually spend traveling. But the other point of it was that if you choose to work from home, then you will not be eligible for any promotion or other work opportunities, which means that you will pretty much remain flat and you will remain at your job for, as long as you want, or you can choose to leave. But basically, you will not be part of the benefits of a growing organization. So those are some of the realities that we're seeing from big tech companies that at one point said, oh, right after COVID, we're going to be remote indefinitely. And suddenly they're realizing they need people to be in the office, and whether or not it's a trust issue, whether or not it's productivity, it's actually better for collaboration, whatever, they just cannot change the tune of what I guess everyone's now expecting of what work culture is really like or looks like.
Agreed.
What is your viewpoint on this? I know we're kind of deviating a little bit, but a lot of this has to do with now, do the employees have more influence compared to before, when they were privileged to work for a big company or a startup company?
Yeah, I think you and I discussed this casually before, is that there's also a generational shift, and the generational shift is driving these differences in perspective around the world of work. So, if Amazon says, okay, well, you're going to be exempt from any advancement opportunities or promotions or, growth and learning opportunities on the job. I was just reading an article this morning that said Gen Z doesn't care about that stuff. They're just quite happy where they are. It's not worth it. It's more stress on me. So I rather would not have the extra money and the extra stress. I'm quite happy staying where I am. Thank you very much. Middle management, not really a career goal for me. So there's a mismatch here between what we think of, what leaders and management think of in terms of what employees want and what they want for themselves. So I think this hybrid thing is good. It's sticky. It's going to be around for a while yet.
Right.
But the whole proximity bias and not being in the office very often. So, I'm not spending as much time with Hessie. So she's going to overlook me when promotions come along. But I'm in the office all the time. So Hessie and I chat all the time. Maybe there's some of that because we are human beings that way. That social interaction does make an impact. But I think a lot of people are just reconsidering what's really important to them. And never before have I seen this shift in terms of this me thing. And I think you and I talked about this as well. It's like, it's not just about my career, but I really do want that balance, that work and life. I want to have a life outside of work. We've been talking about work-life balance for decades, and people have always argued over whether it's even a valid concept and how do you find a balance and how do you keep it once you do supposedly find it. Never before have I seen in these younger generations that emphasis that drives everything. I'm not willing to travel any more than 15 minutes if you do want me to come in the office. So it's going to change our perspectives around work for sure, and it's going to be very interesting to watch.
You've seen this with some of your startups who maybe have headquarters around the world, right?
Yeah.
And we know in other cultures. I know in China, in India, I'm not sure, maybe in India, maybe in Japan, where there is very much a work culture and there is no work-life balance.
Yes.
Do you think there is a shift there with the younger populations in terms of what they want and their mental health being a priority?
Yes, and a good case in point would be Japan, where I grew up, where my family's from, both sides. That has been a work culture to the extreme, right? They have a term called karoshi, which is where you literally die because of working too hard. And that has been the norm. You work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. You rarely see your wife and your family. You pop in maybe for an hour or so on a Sunday, and then you're back at work again. You devote yourself wholly and fully to your company, because in Asian cultures, the group, whether it's the family or the company or the country, are more paramount than the individual. That has always been the case in a very hierarchical society. But as you pointed out, the younger generation these days, they are dismissing that. They're dismissing the whole working for one company from graduating university until when I retire. They're saying, well, I'm bored of working at Toyota now. I'm actually going to go work at a tech startup. So the generation of my grandparents would have said, what the hell are you doing? This isn't the way Japanese society is supposed to be, but this is the way the younger generation, regardless of where they call home, that's the way that they're leaning. Is I want that variety of experiences. I don't want to be loyal to one company. And this whole concept of loyalty is also going out the window now too. What is being loyal to a company?
Exactly.
The average tenure in a tech company still right now is about 2 to 2.5, 3 years max. Wow. Compare that to a company in Asia where you're working, like I said, for 25 or 30 years. It's night and day.
I live in a household where my husband had, I think he's going on his 28th or 29th year at a big corporation.
Yeah.
And then there's a dichotomy because his wife has been working at companies maybe an average 2.5, 3 years.
Yeah.
And then decided to start her own business and then on the fly decide, oh my God, that looks really good. I want to go over there and try something like that.
Yeah.
So I think there has been an acceptance, I think, over time that variety of
Yes.
experience is
Yes.
much more valuable than
Yes.
staying with one institution for life.
Yes, yes. And that affects kind of the recruitment side as well, because if you've been a recruiter, you've been a headhunter, you've been a hiring manager, you have traditionally been told when you look at an individual's resume, you should see a linear path. It should be almost a straight line. What they do should be exactly the same. They just gain more seniority, more experience, more wisdom as time goes on. And if you see a resume where somebody is bouncing around from back and back, there's a gap of 6 months because they went to Nepal to study Buddhism, then they came back and then they worked in the corporate sector, that person's too flighty. They're a flight risk. You shouldn't hire them. That's been the traditional bias against individuals who've had that sort of a resume. But ultimately, it's those people who don't have Ivy League school education, who maybe grew up in a tough neighborhood. Those are the ones who are ultimately maybe going to do better in a startup. So this is why we need to look much deeper than what's written on paper and get to know the individual more, because the resume doesn't tell the whole story. And we form a lot of biases, often inaccurate and inappropriate ones, based on what we see.
That's interesting. I know we deviated a lot, but I mean, I think
Sorry.
this is important because, I mean, this is about how employees will find their next thing and what are the things that employers will value. And these days, when I'm on LinkedIn, I think the people within my network, I see people who are doing 2 or 3 concurrent things at the same time, right?
Yes.
And whether or not it's starting a nonprofit on the side, starting like a little, business while they have their day job, that's indicative of the kind of, I'd say, startup economy that we're seeing, right? The gig economy.
The gig economy, right? And that having 1 or 2 side hustles in addition to your full-time job has partially been driven because of financial circumstances,
right?
But it's also because, my full-time job is the one I dislike, but it's the one that's paying the bills. My side hustle is the one that's actually tapping into my passions and my interests. So my evenings are spent doing that. My weekends are spent doing that. So I think that's a good thing. But how's that? A lot of traditional employers are going to, they turn their nose up at that, saying, well, no, I want you to be focused on my company and my company alone. If you run a floral business on the side, that's taking time away from working for me. Right. So attitudes toward work and gigs and full-time, part-time, all of that's going to change a lot.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask you like one last question, because as you know, we're coming up to the end of the year. I want there to be a little bit more, maybe some hope about what's going to come next.
Okay.
Will 2025 be a different year? And you don't have to say it is going to be better, but here's I'm going to give you a little bit of background. What I've read is that the investment environment is expected to be a little bit more stable compared to the volatility that we've seen in previous years, with a focus on sustainable growth and profitability. That's just in general. Right. Venture capital are likely to prioritize startups with strong fundamentals, clear paths to profitability, and innovative solutions on real world problems. Now, that's debatable what is considered real world. But what is your advice to startup founders in a much more, positive economic climate? And what do you suggest their growth plans should be like in the coming year?
Okay. So I would agree that the economic picture, the economic climate for next year should be better than this year, but it's going to be a measured improvement. Back in 2023, we saw startup hiring slashed by up to 50% in some industries. We saw more than 250,000 people laid off. This year to date, we're a bit more than half of that number. So that's a good sign that the overall turbulence of the last 18, 24 months is starting to subside. So that's positive. Next year, I think hiring is going to still be lackluster, at least in larger companies, because cash is still going to be tight. But what I want all startups, regardless of what funding stage you're at, is I want you to ask yourself a few things. Number one, is this role important now? Do we really need to hire someone? Can we make do without this person? Can we bring on an independent contractor and not hire full time, or can AI help us somehow? I think the overall goal for 2025 for many startups will be to run leaner, be more efficient, be much more agile without increasing too much in size or in structure. We're not going to see, as we said, overhiring and doubling or tripling of team sizes anymore. That's gone. One thing though, before you start hiring again, and I understand that people may be tempted to because there are so many great free agents out there right now. I want people to take some time to do some workforce planning first. And that means re-examining the overall composition of your team right now. Not just do we have the right number of people, but do we have the right kind of people? Are they in the right roles? Did we hire them at the right time, as in too early or too late? And did we hire them for the right price? This kind of reflection is really, really important. So if you're a software or a SaaS startup, traditionally about half of your first 10 hires will be technical. And another 3 or so will be go-to-market roles. So marketing, sales, customer success, for example. And the final 2 or so will be in ops and admin. So HR, legal, finance, for example. If the balance of your team composition is off, and obviously this problem is magnified the bigger your team is, it will slow you down. It will steer you off course. It's going to place undue stress on people, and it's going to drain your comp. It's going to drain your cash flow. So the bottom line is, even if you have the budget and the opportunity to hire, say, 2 fantastic software engineers next year, it would be ill-advised to do so unless you have the right structure, the right process, to absorb and manage these people properly. Because most people don't. They'll just hire right away, saying, oh, we need this person, without thinking about the actual implications on the rest of the team. Maybe you're too heavy on one side and too thin on another. You still need to maintain that big picture perspective.
Okay.
And yeah, when we talked about return to office, just one quick thing about that. If you have a return to office mandate, an RTO mandate, or you're considering one, you really should abandon it. Because right now, telling people that they have to work in the office full time, that's basically the same as telling people you pay the least.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're going to lose people, guaranteed. You should focus your energy on improving that existing hybrid work environment that you have, because that is going to be the future for the next while, at least until robots take our jobs. Anyway.
You're actually segueing into a new topic for next time, I think. So talk about, the future employee, the robots who will take
be a robot.
Be a
chatbot. Yeah.
Well, thank
Can't
you.
wait.
I think you and I will be long gone by that time. We'll see. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Glenn, for joining me.
My pleasure.
It
Thank
seems
you.
like based on everything that we had talked about today, we're talking about being cautious and yet optimistic about the future, at least 2025, right?
Absolutely.
So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
And for our audience, if you have any topics that you want us to explore, please email us at communications@altitudeaccelerator.ca. Tech Uncensored, it's powered and produced by Altitude Accelerator. We're hosted on Spotify. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, everyone, have fun and stay safe.